Today we're talking prophecies, chosen ones, good gods, evil gods, wyverns, wolves, and yes, giants. Absolutely terrifying giants. And honestly, we need more giants in fantasy. Of course, I'm diving into Malice by John Gwynne, the first book in the Faithful and the Fallen series, and it is epic fantasy through and through. This one shot to the top of my TBR after a bunch of people recommended I read it after I finished the First Law trilogy, with some people claiming Gwynne as a better action writer than Abercrombie. I mean, fantasy fans are nothing if not opinionated when it comes to well-written action, so I went in expecting brutal, visceral, and maybe even savage storytelling. And well, Malice turned out to be a big surprise, in some really interesting ways. So let's dig into what Malice is all about, what worked, what didn't, and whether this epic fantasy should be on your shelf. Malice is classic epic fantasy with a fresh twist. The story is set in the Banished Lands. It's a world steeped in ancient prophecies and teetering on the edge of an apocalyptic clash between good and evil. The setup feels familiar, but Gwynne manages to breathe new life into these old tropes, adding just enough of his own flair to keep things from feeling stale. At the heart of the story is Corbin, a young boy from a small village who dreams of becoming a warrior. His arc has all of the hallmarks of a traditional coming-age story, but Gwynne layers it with the sense of realism that grounds Corbin's journey. He's not immediately thrust into greatness. Instead, we see him struggle, train, and make mistakes. His growth feels earned, and that makes him easy to root for, even when the story around him leans into classic Chosen One territory. But Corbin is just one thread in this much larger tapestry. Malice is told through 7 points of view, and the overall cast is sprawling. You've got kings and warriors, schemers and loyalists, and everyone in between. The sheer number of perspectives adds to the epic scope, but it also means the book takes its time getting started. You'll need a bit of patience as Gwynne sets the stage, but if you're the kind of reader who enjoys sinking into the world and getting to know its inhabitants, there's a lot to enjoy here. One thing I really appreciated was how Gwynne handled the good versus evil dynamic. On the surface, it's just a bit basic. There's a god that's very obviously good, and there's a god that's very obviously evil. But the way this plays out in the story is a lot more nuanced. Part of the fun of reading Malice is trying to figure out which characters are going to end up on which side of this cosmic chessboard. There's a sense of looming dread as prophecies start to unfold, and even the more traditional fantasy elements, like the prophecy itself, are handled with a darker, almost horror-like twist. And we need to talk about the giants. I love how Gwynne uses the giants in this story. They're not just big brutes swinging a club, they're woven into the lore and the politics of the world. There's this really cool giants versus man conflict that adds a layer of tension to the plot. While the world of Malice feels vast and layered, Gwynne's approach to magic is surprisingly subtle. It's not a hard magic system with strict rules and mechanics. Instead, it feels more like a whisper in the background. Is there when needed, but never overpowering the narrative. This might be a drawback if you love magic front and center of your fantasy, but for me, it added to the grounded, almost historical feel of the story. The structure of the book is ambitious. Gwynne doesn't hold your hand. There's no lengthy exposition or overly convenient character introductions. Instead, you're dropped into the world and left to find your own bearings. This approach is both a strength and a weakness. On one hand, it makes the world feel real and lived in. On the other, it contributes to that slower pacing, especially in the first half of the book. And while the book leans into traditional fantasy archetypes, there's a sense that Gwynne is playing the long game. You get the feeling that some of these seemingly straightforward characters and tropes might twist into something entirely different in later books. The prophecy feels less like a guiding light and more like a storm cloud on the horizon. Malice sets the stage for something big. It's not a story that rushes to the finish line. Instead, it invites you to settle in, get to know the world and its characters, and brace yourself for what promises to be an epic journey through the series. There's an old school charm to it, but with enough modern grit and nuance to keep it from feeling like a retread of what's come before. Alright, let's get into the real meat of it. Malice has a lot going for it, but also a few things that held it back from being an instant favorite. First off, the scope of the story is undeniably epic. Gwynne isn't afraid to play the long game, and you can feel the ambition in every chapter. He's building a world with deep lore, complicated politics, and a prophecy that looms over every action and reaction. That sense of scale is impressive, and it scratches the itch for fans of sprawling fantasy like A Song of Ice and Fire or The First Law. But here's the thing, this epic scope is both a blessing and a curse. 3/4 of Malice is essentially all build-up. It's a slow burn, and not the kind where the fuse is sizzling with tension. It's more like stacking kindling for a bonfire, and just when you think it's about to catch, Gwynne adds another log. I found myself waiting for that moment when the story would take off, and while it does eventually, that sense of anticipation never fully paid off for me. A lot of this comes down to the multiple points of view. Gwynne has a huge cast of characters, and while I usually love that in fantasy, here it sometimes worked against the story's momentum. One of the biggest challenges I had was keeping track of who's who. Outside of Corbin, a lot of the characters felt like they blended together. There's nothing inherently wrong with the characters themselves. They're not boring per se, but they often felt like they shared the same voice. I kept having to flip back to remember who the character was, and not because the plot was overly complicated, but because the characters themselves didn't stand out from one another. Things become a little more confusing when each POV character introduces you to like 20 other characters, and they're all fairly reoccurring. Keeping track of their names, their allegiances, and their individual quirks became somewhat of a chore. This is where I couldn't help but think of The First Law. And I'm not trying to make this a direct comparison between the two series, but The First Law, you can pick up any random passage, read a couple of lines, and know exactly which character is speaking. The voices are that distinct. In Malice, I just didn't get that. Except for Corbin and his immediate cast, I honestly couldn't tell you who was who without some effort. And that lack of distinction, it hits hardest during the action scenes. I know Gwynne is highly praised for his combat writing, and technically, the scenes are well done. They're raw and visceral, and I get why so many people love them. But if I don't know or care who the characters are, then the action becomes background noise. The stakes just weren't there for me, and because there's so much action in Malice, it actually slowed the pacing down. I never thought I'd say that, but it felt like the story was stuck in a cycle of fighting without any kind of forward momentum. However, I must say, a really cool detail I found interesting is how different cultures in the Banished Land fight differently. Most of the kingdoms follow a more traditional Celtic-style combat, where warriors throw themselves into battle in chaotic melees. But then you have those from Tenebral, and it stands out because its warriors use tight shield formations and short swords, almost like a Roman legion. Given that Tenebral also has some imperialistic undertones, I don't think that this is a coincidence. It's a small but very deliberate historical nod, and it makes the world feel that much richer. If you're a history nerd like me, details like this are really fun to pick up on. But here's the thing. The structure is another aspect that held the book back for me. Gwynne does this thing where you'll get a scene from one perspective, and then in the next chapter, he rewinds a bit to show the same moment from a different angle. I get the intention, it's supposed to add depth and context, but it often made the story feel like it wasn't progressing. Instead of moving forward, we're just getting both sides of the same coin. It's not a huge issue, but it was noticeable when it happened, and I couldn't help but think that these sections could have been trimmed down or removed entirely. Sometimes it's better to let the reader fill in the gaps and keep the story moving. When it comes to the characters, I didn't truly love or hate any of them. One of the joys of epic fantasy is getting so invested in a character that you either cheer for their every victory or you relish in every failure. With Malice, it just kind of felt neutral. I mean, I love Storm, and she's probably my favorite character in the whole book, and I think Corbin has a lot of potential. Cywin too, or Cohen, or Cewin, or however you pronounce it. But outside of those three, I wasn't really attached to anyone. I wasn't rooting for or against them, and that kind of felt just a bit disconnected for me. The female representation is another mixed bag. Seawyn is really the only female voice, and it often felt like she was there to observe rather than act. She turned into a bit of an exposition tool in that she was always at the right place at the right time and overheard important conversations or witnessed pivotal moments. It's a missed opportunity because the female characters who are present in Malice have a lot of potential, and I wanted more from them. Now, the good versus evil angle is where things get a bit predictable. You can spot the avatar of the good god and the avatar of the evil god from a mile away. It's just a bit on the nose, and while it didn't ruin the experience, it did take away from some of the intrigue. That said, I'm still cautiously optimistic. Gwynne might be setting us up for a twist in the future. Maybe he'll subvert my expectations in the sequels, and I'll look back at Malice with a whole new appreciation. I'd love to be wrong about this and have my assumptions turned on their head. That said, I want to make sure I'm not underselling the good stuff here. When Malice works, it really works. Gwynne's world building is fantastic, and this is where the book shines brightest. The Banished Lands feel like a world with history, where the ruins of past conflicts still linger and the echoes of ancient prophecies ripple through every village and forest. Gwynne layers his world with a sense of realism. His political systems feel lived in. The cultural traditions of the different regions are distinct, and there's a tangible weight to the land's history. The presence of the giants, for example, is not just a cool fantasy trope. It ties into the broader conflict between man and the world around them. There's a great sense of man versus myth, civilization versus wild, and they all add to the depth of the story. What I really appreciated is how Gwynne introduces these elements organically. There's no heavy-handed exposition or lore dumps. Instead, the world unfolds naturally through the characters' interactions and the plot itself. It's subtle, but effective. Whether it's the quiet tension of a village on the edge of the wild or the grander scale of warring kingdoms, everything felt cohesive. Overall, Malice does a lot right. It's an epic story with strong action, an intriguing world, and a promise of bigger things to come. But it's also a book that feels like it's still building towards something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the real payoff might not come until later in the series. It's the kind of book that, depending on how the sequels plays out, could either elevate Malice retroactively or reinforce some of the frustrations I had with it. So why should you pick up Malice? Well, if you're a fan of epic fantasy, especially the kind that leans into classic genre elements while still bringing a fresh perspective, this book might just be up your alley. First off, Malice is perfect for readers who love the slow build of a grand multi-book series. It's the kind of story where you can feel the weight of the groundwork being laid. If you enjoy that sensation of sinking into a world and watching the pieces of a much larger puzzle start to align, Malice offers that in spades. The Banished Land feels real, lived in, and dangerous, and Gwynne's attention to detail makes every village, forest, and battlefield feel authentic. If you enjoy complex world building that rewards patience, Malice again delivers. There's a sense of history in the Banished Lands, the remnants of old wars, the echoes of ancient prophecies, and the palpable tension between humans and giants. Gwynne doesn't rush to reveal his hand, and while that slow pacing might not be for everyone, it's a treat for readers who love to explore a world gradually, discovering its secrets along the way. For action enthusiasts, Gwynne's combat scenes are a highlight. While I personally didn't connect with every battle, the way he writes them is undeniably skilled. There's a raw, gritty realism to his fights. They feel more like a skirmishes pulled from a historical saga than the over-the-top cinematic battles you sometimes see in modern fantasy. If you're the type of reader who loves the crunch of steel on bone and the chaos of the battlefield, you're going to find a lot to love here. And animal lovers, take note. Storm might just steal your heart. The bond between this character and their companion is genuinely touching. It's one of those small but impactful elements that add a layer of warmth to the story. And if you're someone who appreciates these softer moments amidst all the grimness, you'll enjoy this aspect of Malice. And while the story does lean into some traditional fantasy tropes, like the Chosen One and good versus evil dynamics, there's a potential for Gwynne to subvert these expectations in future books. If you're a reader who likes to speculate and theorize, there's plenty of room to do that here. I found myself wondering if the seemingly predictable elements were setting up a twist down the line. and that sense of mystery is a big reason why I'm interested in continuing with the series. Overall, if you're a reader who appreciates epic scope, a well-crafted world, and the promise of bigger things to come, Malice is worth a look. It's a book that might not be a knockout punch from page 1, but if you're willing to settle in for the long haul, I think there's a strong chance you'll be rewarded as the series unfolds. Alright, so where do I ultimately land on Malice? Well, it's a bit complicated. On one hand, this book offers an immersive, ambitious start to an epic fantasy series that clearly has big plans. The world building is excellent, with a genuine sense of history, and a place that makes the Banished Lands feel like they could have been mapped out right alongside Middle-earth or Westeros. There's a tangible depth to the lore, and the dynamic between humans and giants, along with the prophecy, adds a lot of intrigue. Gwynne's writing style is straightforward but effective. And while I didn't always connect with the characters, I can appreciate how meticulously he set the stage for future books. I think readers who love classic fantasy with a modern twist are going to find a lot to enjoy here. The combat is visceral, the world is rich, and the promise of an epic multi-book arc is definitely present. That said, Malice isn't without its shortcomings. The pacing is a slow burn that sometimes smolders without quite catching fire. The large cast of characters, while impressive, often blended together, which made the action scenes feel more like a white noise rather than a page-turning excitement. Despite these critiques, I'm still invested. I genuinely want to see where this story goes. I've heard that later books in the Faithful and the Fallen series builds on this foundation in really exciting ways, and if that's true, Malice might just end up being one of those first books that grow on you the more you fall deeper in love with a series. So, would I recommend it? Yes, but with a bit of a caveat. If you're looking for a fast-paced, character-driven fantasy, this might not scratch that itch. At least not right away. But if you're someone who loves world-building, epic lore, and a story that takes its time setting the board before making its move, then Malice could be a great fit. And hey, if nothing else, you'll get to meet Storm, one of the best animal companions I've read in a long time. If you know, you know. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends, family, and even your enemies. Just no evil gods or giants. And of course, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button because every subscriber inches me one step closer to taking over the Galaxies. Until next time, take care, keep reading, and I'll see you in the next one.